I'm super excited to start our next book by Gary Blackwood. It is called The Shakespeare Stealer, and I want you to take a look at the cover. Before starting a book, it's always a good idea to make note of what the publisher and the design people behind this book decided to emphasize on the cover. So you can see in the corner there's a person who seems to be on stage, because if you look really closely, there's a bunch of people on the ground or on the chairs, almost like in an auditorium setting. And there's a person here above them, and the person is holding a skull. And if you remember the story about Hamlet and my summary of that very, very famous tragedy by William Shakespeare, there is a scene, of one of the most important scenes from the play, where Hamlet is talking to Yorick's skull in the cemetery. And then over here, there's a younger boy, and there's a curtain here, and he's looking, I think, in a little way, like a little bit suspicious, or maybe he's looking a little hesitant or scared, but his eyes definitely don't communicate excitement and happiness, right? And he is holding a little satchel. He has a sword right here. He's obviously wearing the clothing from that time period. And then there's some paper here and what looks like a little like quill pen. So on the back of the book, I didn't even point this out, sorry. And then there's also, if you look above the person carrying or holding up the skull, you can also see it looks like there are some people up at the top looking down at him, like in a balcony situation. So we have to assume that this is a stage, and this boy is behind the curtain. And it says on the cover, he was sent to steal a play from Shakespeare himself. So I just got dark all of a sudden. I'm not sure why. Let's see if I can find the light again. My room, the sun just went down, I think, or a cloud just covered the room. Okay, I'm back. So on the back cover, then, it says, steal Shakespeare's play Hamlet, ... or else. That is the order from his fearsome master, in which a poor orphan with the rare ability to write a unique coded shorthand has no choice but to follow orders. So Widge works his way into the Globe Theater. We know the Globe Theater is where William Shakespeare and his troupe performed all of the plays. So Widge works his way into the Globe Theater, where Shakespeare's troupe rehearses and performs. The players take him in and treat him as one of their own. Afraid to disappoint his master, but unwilling to betray his new friends, Widge is torn. Will he secretly copy down the lines until he decides he must play the part of his life? And it's a fast-moving historical novel, says SLF or J? SLF? Starred Review. And I will tell you, the reason it's historical is because Shakespeare does exist. He did exist. And it's also set during that time period. And you will learn a little bit about what was happening in the world during this book. And you'll also just get a better sense of what life was like during Shakespearean times. So after we've looked at the front and the back cover, I usually just like to dive in. And it begins on page 3, chapter 1. And notice again that there are no chapter titles. So a really, really good way to organize your notes and your thinking about the book is by, after finishing the chapter, it's really important to title the chapter. Make some kind of written reminder about what the book is about. Or not the book, but what the chapter is about. And then that way, if you want to find information again from a certain chapter, it would be really easy for you to find the information quickly if you name the chapter a certain title that will help you remember what was in that chapter. Okay? We're going to start chapter 1. I'm going to read it out loud to you. And it's really important that you annotate. And by that, I mean, just like we talked about with the last book, writing little notes in the margins or underlining important events or new events. Now, it's the first chapter, so there's going to be a lot of new things, but I'm going to guide you a little bit so that you're not underlining everything, because there's no point in underlining every single thing. If you underline everything, it's basically the same as underlining nothing. But I'm going to help you with the first few chapters just so we can all have similar annotations, and you also know for sure that you're doing it the right way. So, page 3. I hope you have your pencil or highlighter or something. Okay. I never knew my mother or my father. As reliably as I can learn, my mother died the same year I was born, the year of our Lord, 1587, the 29th of Queen Elizabeth's reign. So here's the time period. We have the year 1587. Queen Elizabeth is the queen. And we have this character. And if you hadn't read the back cover, you wouldn't know what the character is named. But the back cover tells us that we're reading about the boy Widge, a poor orphan with this rare ability to write a unique coded shorthand, which we'll talk about later. So he's an orphan, doesn't know his mom or dad because they left him or they died when he was born. And it's the year 1587. The name I carried with me throughout my youth was attached to me, more or less accidentally, by Mistress McGregor of the orphanage. I was placed in her care by some neighbor. When she saw how small and frail I was, she explained, "Oh, that poor little pigwidgeon." From that unfortunate expression came the appellation of Widge, which stuck to me for years like pitch. It might have been worse, of course. They might have called me Pig. So we're going to underline some things here. The first thing is I do want you to underline 1587 in the first paragraph because that is our setting. I also want you to underline or bracket. You could put little brackets around that second paragraph because it tells the story of Widge's last name. First name, not last name. Widge doesn't know what his actual birth name is. His parents died. They weren't able to give him a name. And the only reason why he's named Widge, or nicknamed Widge, is because the orphan lady said, "Ugh, that poor little pigwidgeon." And the name, so we know now his nickname has become Widge. There's also a couple words that I would assume you guys don't know. And one of the words is appellation. And that is another word for nickname. So from that unfortunate expression came the appellation of Widge. So that is what his nickname or how other people refer to him as. And then there's another word that is in the second to last line of that second paragraph, pitch. You guys all know about pitch. When you are singing a song, you might be on key or off key, and they might have to tell you to find the music teacher might tell you to find the right pitch or find the right note. We're not talking about that kind of pitch. So since you have your computers, I do want you to look up different definitions of pitch, because pitch can also be like a tar-like substance that they use for different purposes, like building material or what you might find on a roof back during this time period. So look up pitch and try to find pitch in terms of like a building material, not in terms of like a singing word, singing vocabulary word. Of my life at the orphanage, I have made it a habit to recall as little as possible. So if you are going through life and you're thinking, I don't want to recall much, maybe it's because there's not much to recall, or maybe because it's just bad and you don't want to remember it because there's nothing good about it. But of my my life at the orphanage, I have made it a habit to recall as little as possible. The long and short of it is, it was an institution, and institutions are governed by expediency. And that just means like by just wanting to be quick and fast and just do what you have to do, but not do it because you really care about it. It's kind of like when your mom and dad says, clean your room. You're going to clean it as quickly and as easily as you possibly can, just so you can do what you really want to do. That's what expediency is. So I can think of lots of things that I do with expediency. And then I can also think of a lot of things that I do because I just love it so much. So if I'm drawing a picture or writing a poem, I'm going to spend a lot of time on it because I love it. But if I have to, take out the trash, I'm not going to take forever to do it. I'm going to go out, push the trash can over to the curb, and if it's like a little crooked or not, I'm not going to fix that. I'm just going to leave it there, right? So the orphanage where Widge is governed by expediency. Mistress McGregor was not a bad woman, just an overburdened one. Occasionally she lost her temper and beat one of us, but for the most part, we were not mistreated so much as neglected. So, they weren't abused, but they definitely were not, people weren't saying, oh, how are you doing? And tell me how you really are feeling and what can I do for you? Okay, they weren't mistreated, but they definitely were not, loved and cared for the way your parents would love and care for you. The money given us by the parish, like a religious institution or organization, the money given us by the parish was not enough to keep one child properly clothed or fed, let alone 6 or 7. We depended mostly upon charity. When someone felt charitable, when somebody felt like giving, our bellies were relatively full. Otherwise, we dined on barley mush and wild greens. When times were hard for others, they were doubly so for us. So when other people were suffering or didn't have enough to give, then it doubled their needs. It was even harder for the orphanage to survive. It was the dream of each child within those dreary walls that someday a real family would come and claim him. Preferably, it would be his true parents, who were, of course, royalty, but any sight would do, or so we thought. And in that paragraph, think about that. Every kid, if they're an orphan, every kid can imagine what their actual birth parents were like. Every kid would probably say, I bet my mom was, or I bet my father was. And, it makes sense that these orphans sometimes dream that their real mother and father, their real biological parents, are royalty. So that was kind of like a sarcastic, hopeful line. But don't think that Widge is born of royalty, because he's not. But I'm going to read that paragraph again just so you can understand like his frame of mind. It was a dream of each child within those dreary walls that someday a real family would come and claim him. Preferably, it would be his true parents, who were, of course, royalty, but any sight would do, or so we thought. When I was 7 years of age, my prospects changed. As some say they do every 7 years of a person's life. The grand climacteric, I have heard it called. That orphan's dream suddenly became a reality for me. So I'm actually going to underline that. I'm going to underline that orphan's dream suddenly became a reality for me, because the dream of every orphan is to be adopted. And on this year of his life, the 7th year of his life, he is finally going to leave the orphanage. Okay. The rector, and that's a religious figure, the rector from the nearby hamlet of Berwick came looking for an apprentice. And thanks to Mistress McGregor's praise, settled on me. The man's name was Dr. Timothy Bright. His title was not a religious one, but a medical one. He had studied physics at Cambridge and practiced in the city of London before coming north to Yorkshire. Naturally, I'm grateful and eager to please, and that's an interesting personality piece. So he's grateful that he's being adopted or like assigned to somebody so that he could be their apprentice, but he's also eager to please. I readily did whatever was asked of me, and at first it seemed I had been very fortunate. At first. Can you guys all underline that too? Because, that is a transition word that is going to operate in the same way the word but or however does. It's saying, this is really nice, but, or this is really good, however, and the fact that it says at first it seemed he was in a great situation, that's wonderful. But then all of a sudden we have to remember, okay, at first something's going to happen that's not going to be that great. And at first it seemed I had been very fortunate. Dr. Bright and his wife were not affectionate toward me, nor indeed toward their own children, but they gave me a comfortable place to sleep at one end of the apothecary, the room where the doctor prepared his medicines and infusions. And by the way, if you don't know what an apothecary looks like, you should look up the word apothecary, and you'll see a room full of different, I imagine, like a wizard would have an apothecary, but in this sense, it's a medical, doctor who is trying to come up with different potions and medicines and herbs and other ways that will make people healthy. But look up apothecary, the room where the doctor prepared his medicines and infusions. There was always some potion simmering over a pot of burning pitch. So there's that word again, burning pitch. So pitch, if something's burning and we're saying the pot is over burning pitch, that can give you kind of like a mental idea of what it would look like. And one of my duties was to tend to these. The pitch fire kept the room reasonably warm. I took my meals in the kitchen, though the situation was hardly what we orphans had secretly hoped for. It was more or less what I had expected, with one exception. So is life great? No, but it's not bad either. But here's the exception. So I would underline that too, with one exception. What is the exception? I was to be taught to read and write, not only in English, but in Latin. And not only in Latin, but also in a curious abbreviated language of Dr. Bright's own devising. Charactery, he called it. It was, to use his own words, an art of short, swift, and secret writing, by the which one may transcribe the spoken word as rapidly as it issues from the tongue. Now that's a really, really wordy sentence and definition, but I absolutely need you to underline charactery, he called it. It was, to use his own words, an art of short, swift, and secret writing, by the which one may transcribe the spoken word as rapidly as it is issued from the tongue. Now let me tell you something. How do we use technology? Well, one way, and how is technology helpful for us? Back then, they didn't have copying machines. They didn't have recorders. They didn't have cameras. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have a lot of things. So if I wanted to teach you something, you guys would have to either listen and pay attention really, really closely, memorize what I'm saying, and then teach it to somebody else. A lot of people also, in order to learn information, they would write everything down. But if you had to write every single thing down that I was saying, that would get a little burdensome. Okay, so we've learned how to take notes. We've learned how to write down things quickly without writing incomplete sentences, and we've learned how to, get information down quickly. But it's even better now because I can record this, or I could take, if I wanted to, you could record my voice and then listen back to it. But this is the thing. Dr. Bright had this own way called charactery, which allowed him to write things down really, really quickly in something called shorthand. So maybe a circle would always represent the word talk, and maybe a triangle would always represent, the word education. So he had this code, this secret code for copying notes and information down. So His object, I soon learned, was not to offer me an education so much as to prepare me to be his assistant. I was to keep his scientific notes for him and to transcribe his weekly sermons. So this was a task that Dr. Bright had asked Widge to do, and he was training Widge to do this. And if you're still not clear on what charactery is, I will show you an example of charactery or shorthand so that you understand what Dr. Bright is asking him to do. I had always, his object is soon learned, yes, okay, was to transcribe his weekly sermons. I had always been a quick student, but I was never quick enough to suit the doctor. That's poor thing for him. Like, right, he has a doctor that he can't seem to please. He had some idea that his method of stenography could be learned in a matter of mere months, and he meant to use me to prove it. Now, have you ever learned something in mere months, like an actual hard task that you've had to learn? And it was not easy. I can't imagine learning how to play the piano in a month or a couple months. You certainly, all of you guys, did not learn how to talk in a few months. It took some time. So in math skills, writing skills, you don't just learn them in a couple months. But Dr. Bright expected Widge to learn in a few months this very hard task. I was a sore disappointment to him. It was an awkward system, and it took me a full year to become reasonably adept. And adept means reasonably skilled. A whole year. Meanwhile, Dr. Bright's like, come on, haven't you learned it already? You know, we've been practicing this for a few weeks now. He was very impatient to get Widge to do this. I was a sore disappointment to him. It was an awkward system, and it took me a full year to become reasonably adept, and another year before I could set down every word without begging him to speak more slowly. And this bothered him. This vexed him. For once, his ample mouth was set in motion. He did not like to stop it. To his mind, of course, the fault lay not with the system, but with me for being so thick-headed. Okay, do you understand what he's asking him to do? Dr. Bright is saying, all right, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to read a whole chapter to you. I'm going to give you a lecture, and I want you to write down every single word that I say, but in shorthand. And I know how, when I show videos to you guys, I know how a lot of you will be like, pause the video. I haven't finished writing down what I want to write down. Or Miss Holtzman-Rich, can you slow down, or you're talking too fast? Now imagine, now this is your job. Your job as this apprentice is to write down every single thing that Dr. Bright is saying as quickly as possible, every single word. And just imagine the stress of what that might feel like. I never saw him write anything down in his shorthand himself. I am inclined to think he never mastered it. As I grew confident with the system, I began to make my own small improvements in it without the doctor's knowledge, of course. He was a vain man, meaning like he can do no wrong. Because he had once written a book, a dry treatise on melancholy, he felt the world should ever after make special allowances for him. He had written nothing since, so far as I know, except his weekly sermons, and as I was soon to discover, not always those. So it took him a year to learn it, and then another year to become adept at it. And he was adopted, or not even adopted, but he was taken by Dr. Bright from the orphanage when he was 7. So now he's about 9 years old, okay? The next paragraph, though, says, when I was 12. So that means he's been living with Dr. Bright for quite a while now. 5 years, okay? So when I was 12 and could handle a horse as well as a plumbago pencil, the doctor set me off to neighboring parishes each Sabbath to copy other rectors' sermons. So he's going to other churches, other places of worship, sitting in the back, listening to different, ministers and religious leaders give these sermons on Sundays. And then instead of just sitting back and listening like most people do when they go to church, he's writing every single thing down that the rector is saying. So when I was 12 and could handle a horse as well as a plumbago pencil, The doctor set off to neighboring parishes each Sabbath to copy other rectors' sermons. This is important, so you should underline that. He meant, he said, to compile a book of the best ones. I believed him until one Sunday, when the weather kept me home, I sat in on Dr. Bright's service and heard the very sermon I had transcribed at Dewsbury a fortnight before. So Dr. Bright, think about what Dr. Bright is doing. He's saying, hey, go over to this church, write every single thing down that the rector has said, give it to me, because I'm just creating a book, But then he's using that exact sermon for his own sermon, which is another word for plagiarism. I mean, that's exactly what's happening. Imagine if you wrote a speech, or what if you wrote your paper in global studies? You had your speech or your paper all prepared, and then you walk into a room and you see somebody else is using it as their own. It did not prick my conscience, and that's a vocabulary word that you had to look up a little bit ago, last week, I think, before spring break. It did not prick my conscience to know that I had been doing something wrong. We were not given much instruction in right and wrong at the orphanage. As nearly as I could tell, right was what benefited you, and anything which you did you harm was wrong. Can you guys underline that too? So this is like his code. We have the cornerstones, and Widge's code of conduct and his cornerstones are basically, as nearly as I could tell, right was what benefited you, and anything which did you harm was wrong. Imagine living your life that way. My main concern was that I might be caught. I had never asked for any special consideration, but now I asked Dr. Bright, as humbly as I could, to be excused from the task. And he's thinking, I don't want to get in trouble. This doesn't feel right. I don't want to get caught, because if I get caught, I could get in big trouble. So I asked Dr. Bright if I could be excused from the task. He blinked at me owlishly, as if not certain he had heard me properly. Then he scratched his long, red-veined nose and said, "You are my boy, and you will do exactly as I tell you." He said it as though it were an unarguable fact of life. That discouraged me far more than any threat or show of anger could have done. And he was right. According to law, I was his property. I had to obey, or be sent back to the orphanage. As Mistress Bright was fond of reminding me, prentices, another word for saying apprentice, prentices were easily come by and easily replaced. In truth, he had too much invested in me to dismiss me lightly, but he would not have hesitated to beat me, and heavily. So we should assume that if he didn't do his job, Widge would get beaten by Dr. Bright. There's a popular saying to the effect that England is a paradise for women, a prison for servants, and a hell for horses. Prentices were too lowly to even deserve a mention. Eventually, our sermon stealing was discovered. Please underline that too. So we're kind of seeing this gradual, accumulation of events, this domino effect. The wily old rector at Leeds noticed my feverish scribbling, and a small scandal ensued. Though Dr. Bright received only a mild reprimand from the church, he behaved as though his reputation was ruined. So he's thinking, I made a horrible mistake, and he didn't get a horrible, punishment. He didn't go to jail. He got a little, scolding, but now Dr. Bright's whole reputation feels ruined. As usual, the blame fell squarely on my thin-souled shoulders. My existence there, which had never been so much to begin with, went steadily downhill. As I had so often done in my orphanage days, I began to wish for some savior to come by and, seeing at a glance my superior qualities, take me away. So he's back to dreaming again. He's like, man, maybe somebody's going to rescue me. Maybe, another person is going to take me. Or maybe my parents will come back for me. All this wishful thinking. In my more desperate moments, I even considered running away on my own. As I learned to read, and transcribe such books as Holinshed's Chronicles and Raleigh's Discovery of Guyana, I discovered that there was a whole world out there beyond Yorkshire, beyond England, and I longed to see it with my own eyes. So he's contemplating, thinking about running away, and he's longing to see it with his own eyes, but he's also realizing, I can't do this. Up to now, my life had been bleak and limited, and it showed no sign of changing. In a new country such as Guyana, I'm probably mispronouncing that. I will look it up after this. I imagined, or a city the size of London, there would be opportunities for a lad with a bit of wherewithal to make something of himself, something more than an orphan and a drudge. And yet, I had no real hope of ever seeing anything beyond the bounds of Berwick. Indeed, the thought of leaving rather frightened me. So his dreams take him beyond, but his reality is that this is probably it for me. I was so ill-equipped to set out into that world alone. So he had these skills. He knew Latin, he could read, he could write, but he didn't have the skills to survive on his own. Nobody taught him these skills. He's been living with Dr. Bright and his wife for a pretty long time, doing a few things, and then before that he was at the orphanage. So I was so ill-equipped to set out into that world alone. I could read and write, but I knew none of the skills needed to survive in the unfamiliar, perhaps hostile lands that lay beyond the fields and folds of our little parish. And so I waited and worked and wished. If I had any notion of what actually lay in store for me, I might not have wished so hard for it. And that's a great little cliffhanger, and I'm going to put a little bracket around that because, yes, he is hoping to have and experience something else, but he really, he's wishing, but he doesn't really want to act on it because he has no skills. And then at the end it says, if I had any notion of what actually lay in store for me, I might not have wished so hard for it. So he's wishing, not going to act on it, but he's still wishing. And he knows now, like he's kind of looking back on his life as a 12-year-old, and he's like, shoot, I probably shouldn't have wished so hard, because this is just letting us know that, and it's foreshadowing that his life is going to get worse before it gets better. So after you finish, I know we spent a lot of time on this one chapter, and the reason why is because it's important that we understand what's going on here. There are a couple things I want you to look up. I want you to look up pitch. I want you to look up shorthand or charactery. And I also want you to look up an apothecary. So, apothecary, pitch, and also I want you to look up, come up with a title for chapter 1. Some kind of title that's going to help you remember something about which. And then we'll share those later. All right, so we are only on chapter 2, and I know this was a long time, but just look up those words, give it a title, and then we'll do chapter 14 the next time I see you. All right? And there's one other assignment in your Google Classroom that you should look at after finishing chapter 1. All right? See you later.